I am going to talk about another book list that I am reading from. I've mentioned the Poison one that I've been working on. This one is a kind of bizarre subject matter to find a number of books on, but it's about mass graves, and it's about the incidents that have caused a large number of mass graves. And I've actually found 4 books on 4 different incidents that the end result has been some sort of mass grave for some reason. The first one that I have finished is called The White House Boys, An American Tragedy by Roger Dean Kizer. If you've seen the book The Nickel Boys, which won, I believe, a Pulitzer not too long ago, that book was based off of the same thing that this book was written about. This book was written about the Dozier Boys School in North Florida. It was a reform school. It was basically created in the early 1900s, and it was basically for any troubled, disturbed youth. They said that many times what they would consider troubled or criminal or disturbed was very vague. So sometimes you had boys who were there who were just for petty criminal reasons. Sometimes you had them who were much more hardened criminals. In many cases, these were boys who just the system didn't know what to do with. They were either orphan or could not find a placement for, or many situations that they were in an orphanage or things like that they were causing trouble at, or someone said they were causing trouble at, or they were being abused at, so they were acting out there. And because of that, they were sent to this place. Now, this place came back in the news pretty hard in the 90s. Because when they went to sort of look over this place, and stories had gone around for a long time that bad things had always gone on there. There had been, in the early teens, there had been a fire there that had killed 6 boys, and that had partially happened because the people who were the men who were in charge of the place were in town having a night on the town with every bit of debauchery that would allude to. And the boys were left back there, and a fire broke out, and 6 of them died. In the 90s, when they went back there to this school, they found 36 unidentified graves. It was a mass grave. They did not know who these people were. They did not know when they died. They did not know. All they had were white pipe crosses that did not indicate who they were, when they died, what happened, how they got there. Nothing. 6 of them could have been the ones that died in the fire, but that is leaving at least 30 more bodies unaccounted for, and with no record of what would have happened. So because of that, there was very clearly something going on there that was very untoward. And as more and more stories started coming out, detailing the abuse that was suffered there by these preteen and teen boys of many different nature. They were called the White House Boys because there was a white cinder block building. That was where the corporal punishment took place. And when I say corporal punishment, it was pretty well indicated that it was severe beatings. Some of the former inmates say that that might not have been as severe as is being interpreted, but there's a whole lot of other indication the other way as well that I would say it's leaning more towards very, very severe physical abuse happened in that building. There's also, as these jobs happen, they are low paying, and many times these jobs, because of the power structure, will attract people to them who have no business being in power over anybody. And that seems to have also been in the case of this situation, that the people running the school, the ones who are actually on the ground running the school, this was just a way to exhibit control over someone. And that's how they acted out. This is also one of those jobs that if There is not someone keeping a very close eye on what is happening. This is a place that was very easy for predators to infiltrate and take advantage of boys who, many of them were already abused, but take advantage of boys who had no one really looking out for them at all, or anyone to report anything to, or any sort of situation that they could resist. So there was a lot of that happening as well. And Robert Dean Kizer was one of the boys that grew up here. That is why he wrote this book. He pretty well seems to have been brutalized in a multitude of ways, both from the orphanage that he came from and from Dozier Boys School when he got there. It's a really, really horrific situation. This is a horrific book to read. This is not a pleasant book to read at all, because this is somebody who's just kind of relating their trauma and incidents of their trauma at a place that just sort of abandoned them to kind of be eaten alive by men who did not really care for them at all, and in many ways many of them seemed quite disturbed themselves. And I can see that easily happening in a facility like this where nobody's really checking up on anybody, and the jobs being low paying and not really much attention being paid. It's an easy thing to happen in something like this, and the result is just horrific stories of abuse and a lot of bodies that no one knows who they are or what happened. There are several accounts that somebody of a very graphic story where somebody ended up dead in a laundry dryer, and there is to this day that multiple boys have come. They were boys at the time, but multiple men have come forward talking about that, knowing about that, but not knowing who that was or what had happened or where that body went. I don't think there's any intention to dig up the graves there and really see who they are. I don't know if you could, because all the documentation was mysteriously lost when the investigation started by the Dozier School. Many of the people running it are now deceased, of course, and that also makes it very difficult to find stuff about. There was a lot of speculation that when they went to tear down the White House, which they did as sort of a ceremony during the late 90s, I believe, that when they got there was a lot of rumor that the house had been kind of very, very well cleaned to try to do away with any DNA evidence that might have been there, because, of course, it would have been in Florida's best interest to sort of brush this over. But they have acknowledged, there has been an acknowledgement that this place was completely off the chains here, and just completely had derailed. There was also evidence that other people had talked about previously when they'd been reprimanded earlier in the 1900s about the fact that the boys were being kept in chains. There were two different camps. There was one for black teenage boys, and there was one for white teenage boys. They said, and this one is specifically, Kizer is white, so he only knew the one camp because they were completely separate from each other. And they said the white boys camp was much better maintained than the camp for the black teenage boys. And that in a segregated South, that checks out for the time period. And the whole situation is just, many of these, when they tell you kind of at the end what some of these boys had done to get there, this is very minor stuff. Like, some of it was stealing car parts and different things like that you might end up for, a couple days in juvie, but not something that you would run the risk of being beaten to death over. it just really, this is a horrible book. It's a hard read. And it raises a lot of questions. A lot of questions about how all of that went on and nobody who worked there. Because Kizer does talk about one of the house fathers that he said he didn't understand. He seemed like a decent guy. Kizer even writes about him as he seems like a man who kind of cared about what was going on, but he certainly didn't say anything about what was going on either. It's very sad, and it's very bleak. It's a bleak read. This is put out by the same publisher who put out A Child Called It, which I know has had some controversy, because there are some accusations that author kind of made up that story, or at least very much exaggerated from family members. It's really hard to tell who's telling the truth in that sort of situation. But this is the same publisher who tends to do, I hate to say it, abuse memoirs more than any, like, that's their main, like, if you could flip through the back of what they're selling, that's what they're selling. It's a little weird. But anyway, this does have a very good, in the back part after Kizer's done writing, it is a collection of different news stories from papers, it seems like, that talk about the investigation that went on there, which also seems strange to me that the investigation was just sort of kind of perfunctory and then dropped. I mean, you've still got 36 graves out there that we don't know who they are, and it seems like they have no intention of figuring out who these people are. And you almost seem to think if you had DNA evidence, you could figure out something that's going on. One of the book lists I have later on is about John and Jane Doe's, books about John and Jane Doe's that they've tried to locate. And actually several people that I have books about the John and Jane Doe's, they figured out, like the boy in the box, they figured out who that is now by DNA. One of the other ones, the Tamad Shum, they've kind of figured out who that is. And so it seems kind of odd to me that Florida, and I guess Florida has a vested interest in covering it up, but Florida just has kind of, we have acknowledged your pain, and we are very, very sorry that all this happened to you, and we have a ceremony, but we're not really going to pursue any of it. I don't know. I have not looked into very, very recent when it comes to the boys' school. I don't know if the Nickel Boys coming out might have affected more of that, but I've not really heard much. And it's kind of a weird thing that it feels like just putting a plaque up and saying we're sorry fixes it, when you've got a mass grave that we don't know who these people are or how they died. I don't know. Like I said, this is a hard book to stomach. I think it's important to be aware of these situations that happened to what you would call throwaway teens, but it is definitely an unpleasant read. It is not something that I would want to dwell on much. And there's a blue jay who's apparently agreeing with me over there. But so that is my first one on my grave reading list. Very bleak, very, very tragic, and very preventable, it feels like in this case, and should have been checked up on, and is still, I feel like, being kind of ignored in the greater scheme of things. No one's heard of this much. I know I hadn't up until recently when it was a podcast that was talking about mass graves, and this one was brought up. And that seems kind of inexcusable, that you don't have answers. This was a government facility and you don't have answers. So I would suggest reading this book, but I would very much say you're not going to enjoy it. And that's the point, I think. Some things are important to read and be aware of, but not necessarily enjoy. So, and this is maybe the most like that I've read in quite a while. So that is that book on that reading list, and kind of a bleak reading list, but I think perhaps a more important one than some.